These are the fork tubes from a 1983 R100RS, and I'm going to rebuild them using Racetech cartridge emulators. Before I do that, I want to check them to see if they're straight. So I use a glass plate and a 2,000th feeler gauge, and I run the gauge underneath the tube all the way along. And then I rotate it and continue to do that about 90 degrees, 90 degrees, 90 degrees. So I measured about 4 different locations. What I've found is that there's one area, which I've marked here and here, where there's a little bit of deformation in the tube, and I could get a 2,000th to slide underneath, but not a 3,000th. So this is a section of tube where the tube's been bent this way, both of them, and that I think aligns with where the front of the tube was, because also on that face is some scoring down here, which is caused by the fork slider rubbing into the fork tube, and that typically is what happens on the front of the fork. So it makes some sense that this is going to be the front of the fork when it was originally installed in the bike. And as shocks hit the front tire going this way, meaning road potholes and things like that, you get a little bit of a bend, but it's not enough to be worried about. So when I install them, I'm going to make sure this and this point to the front. And to help me do that, I've drawn a line which is on the front face of the fork tube on each of them. So that way when I go to install them, I'll just put the lines where I can see them pointing to me. And both tubes will have their slight kink in the same location, pointing in the same direction. That's going to minimize stiction of the slider on the tube, so the forks will be smoother. To remove the damper rod, there's a snap ring here in the bottom of the fork tube, so I'm going to use my snap ring pliers to get that out. To take the rod apart, I just pull off the plastic seal on this end, and this part screws onto the rod, and you can back it off by hand. And once you get that off, then you can slide all the parts off the rod. And when you do that, be careful to just keep them in order as you take them off, so that you don't get confused when you have to reassemble it. So these are the 2 damper rods. This one is still together. I marked it with an A, and also the fork tube it came out of, so I'll keep all the parts together with the right fork tube. Now I took it apart so I can show you the pieces a little clearer. This is the snap ring, and then this is the bottom sleeve, which has a face on it, and the spring fits in like that. Now the second sleeve doesn't have a face, but it's got a shoulder, and one side is deeper than the other. The deep side fits on the spring, and then the white plastic washer goes in on the shallow side. Then this is the plate with the holes that fits over it like that. And then the second spring. Now the 2 springs are exactly the same length. They're 33 millimeters on this bike, so I suspect they are not sagged. Now there's one other hole at the top, which is for the rebound. So the fluid moves through that on fork rebound, and the fluid goes in through this hole on a fork compression. According to the Racetech instructions, at the bottom of the rod where the damper hole is, there needs to be a total of 6 of them. They need to be 6 millimeters in diameter. That's pretty close to 15/64. Now there's an original 1, 2 holes at the bottom, So to get to 6 holes, I need to add 4 more. Now to keep the rod strong, the next set of holes need to be drilled at a 90-degree face from the original ones. So I made a mark here so that it's 10 millimeters on center from the original hole and another mark on the other side. And then from that, another 10 millimeters on center is another set of holes, again rotated 90 degrees. So this hole and this hole are going to end up on the same face as the original holes. So that's what I need to do next. Just to clarify on the bottom hole, it's very, very close to the foot here, and I actually couldn't get a 6 millimeter. So I could fit in about a 7/32 drill bit, and that's about 5.5. So that's going to have to do on the bottom hole. So I have the damper rod in the rubber jaws in my vise, and I'm going to use a center punch and push it in to get a dimple like that, and then drill the hole. Now the aluminum's pretty soft, so I'm going to go fairly slow. Now that I've drilled the holes, I want to put a chamfer in it. So I'm using a 5/16 bit and just gently drill around the hole to open it up at the top just a little bit. After I had slightly drilled out the top of the hole, I took my small round file and dressed that to clean it up. And then I used a 5/16 drill bit and wrapped the shank with some 600 grit wet dry and sanded around to smooth up the edges, clean everything up. Now to get the burrs out of the inside, I used a rat tail file and ran it in to clean off any burrs. And then I have a bristle brush and ran that through in my parts washer to get all the debris out. And then just because I thought it looked nice, I took a little bit of steel wool and just burnished up the outside and then made sure everything was nice and smooth around the entry to the holes. I want to remove the foot off the damper rod, and it's a press fit, but sometimes this is the bolt hole that you run the big bolt in that holds the fork lower onto the damper rod. Sometimes that gets tightened so hard that it deforms the aluminum, so it can be a little hard to get this to come loose. So I put a small Phillips screwdriver in my vise, and then I can stick the damper rod on the screwdriver through the damper hole, and then take a pair of vice grips on the outside of the part here. See if I can get a good grip on it. There. And then, there it goes. That one was tight. Okay, here it comes. There, and it slides off that way. This is the Cartridge emulator kit that I got from Racetech, and this is the part number for the parts that will fit my bike's forks. There's also an adapter that I needed, which is that particular part number, and that adapter will fit on the bottom of the cartridge and fits over the top of the damping rod. Now, in the standard kit are a couple of different sets of springs which are different colors, and on the cartridge emulator is a spring which is the preferred spring, and this is the compression damping spring. So it's adjustable, and that's a way to tune these forks to give you the behavior you're looking for. Now, to set the compression damping, there's a special setup sheet that you print out, and you're given in the parts kit you receive a special one-time only use code, and when you fill that in and some other information, it prints out the specifications for how to set up the cartridge emulators. In particular, it's an important piece here, 2.5 turns of preload, and that applies to the number of turns here on this screw to compress the spring. And then there's also some information regarding how to set up the forks for the right amount of sag and the fork oil configuration. So the trick is to loosen this up until just the top of the last washer is just touching the face of the Allen bolt, and then tighten that up 2.5 turns. Now there's an Allen on the top that you use to set the pressure by setting the number of turns. However, that's an odd sized Allen. I think it may be a 3.5. I don't have anything like that. But what I did find is a Torx 20 will fit that head. So that's what I'm going to use. And a 9mm will fit the lock nut. So all I do is back the nut here, the Allen, off. And then I get the spring loose, and I want to set the head so it's just touching on the top of the little washers. So I just jiggle it a little as I tighten it, and I can now tighten it by hand because I backed off that lock nut. And that seems to be about right. So I don't have any free play in the washer stack. Now I'm going to use a Sharpie and just make an index line on the head of the Allen and the side of the washer stack so I can tell how many turns. And then I'm just going to go ahead and turn the Allen until I get to 2.5 turns. So that's 1, and that's 2, and that's 3. Sorry, 2.5. So now I need to tighten up the lock nut, and I have to be careful. It's pretty tight on the shaft, and if I keep tightening it after it touches the body of the emulator, that will change my setting. So you just want to do that gently and keep an eye on your lock nut. And if I hang on to the body and I hang on to the Torx, I think I can keep everything from going anywhere. Okay, that's snugged up. And if I look at my index mark here and here, it's still at 2.5. Now the other thing I'm going to do is just mark that on the body, so I remember that I've set this one to 2.5 turns. And then if I ever remove it and need to adjust it, at least I'll know what it was that it was originally set for. This is the Racetech fork spring. It's a little different length than the stock BMW spring, so you have to install these with the cartridge emulators. And these are the BMW fork spring end caps that fit on the stock BMW springs, but they fit on the Racetech springs as well. And the way they go is they just sort of screw on, and then they catch up against the face of the spring, and they provide a flat surface on both ends, which helps keep the spring square in the fork tube and prevents them from rubbing up against the inside of the tube. This is the Racetech cartridge emulator and the adapter that comes with it that fits on the bottom, and then that's going to fit on the top of the damper rod like this, and then the fork spring end cap slides over and sits on it like that. So that's how the cartridge emulator will be fit inside the fork tube. So I want to clean out the inside of the tube, make sure there's no debris in there. So I'm using a piece of all thread and some shop rag, and then I can just thread that into the tube and run it through and clean it out. Yeah, that's looking pretty clean. I don't think there's any debris in there. Now inside the bottom of the fork tube, there's a shoulder right about that deep into the tube. And that's what the springs on the damper rod catch on. So in order to install the damper rod, I need a way to compress those springs far enough so that I can expose the groove here for the snap ring. So I'm using a piece of all thread for a drawbar, and I think 26 inches long is about right. This is a little bit shorter, but it works okay. On this end is where the end cap for the bottom fork damper spring will fit. So it's going to slide over the rod like that. And I'm going to secure it with a flat washer. This one's about 23 millimeters outer diameter. And then I put a second washer on top of that, and that fits the face of the nut. Now, one of the things that you have to be careful of is that the snap ring has little ears on it, and you have to have enough room to compress the ears and not bump into the edge of the flat washer. 23 millimeters seems to be about right, and then you can get that washer back out after you get the snap ring in. Then on the other end, I'm using a large fender washer and a somewhat smaller washer, and then that's how I'll attach the all thread on the back end. Just tighten up the nuts and I'll compress the damper rod springs far enough that I can get the snap ring into the groove. So this is the fork damper rod assembly, and this is the damper rod that I drilled the extra holes in, and it's threaded at the top for this sleeve. Now the sleeve has a groove to hold the plastic oil seal. I bought a new one of those, and it just snaps in like that with the little feet lining up. And then you screw it on the top end of the damper rod. And then the upper fork damper spring goes on. And then the metal plate with the holes. And then the white plastic washer. And then this is the fork spring retainer cap for the lower spring, which has a deep pocket and a shallow pocket. And the shallow pocket goes on so it covers up the white washer. And then the bottom damper spring goes on, and the bottom retaining cap for the spring goes on. Now, all of this, with the exception of the upper spring, is going to catch on this end against the sleeve in the bottom of the fork tube. And I have to compress the spring far enough that I can get the snap ring into the groove. So I'll use my drawbar to do that. And then when it's all done, this is the foot that goes on the end of the damper rod, and it gets secured by the big Allen bolt that holds the lower fork slider onto the bottom of the damper rod. So I have the fork tube mounted in the vise, and I'm going to push the damper rod in, but I want to do it gently so I don't disrupt or disturb that seal as it goes by the shoulder. There it goes. And then the spring, the upper spring, will go past the shoulder. There it goes. And then there we go. There's everything in. Now I can push the tube out of the way because I really don't need it at the moment. And then I'll install my drawbar to compress the spring and get the bottom spring retainer far enough inside the fork tube that I can get the snap ring in. So I have the drawbar installed, and the large flat washer I have just a little bit off center, which gives me a little more room for the ears on the snap ring to go in. Now I have the bottom spring retainer compressed enough that the groove right here for the snap ring is exposed, so I should be able to get it in. Now, as I mentioned, the large washer is a little off center, and that's going to give me some room with the snap ring. So I'm going to put the ears down on the bottom here, because that's going to give me some space for those to fit. So I just squeeze my pliers and lay them in there. And then I want to be sure the ring is seated, so I'm going to use a small screwdriver and my mallet and just tap, and I could hear it snapping into the groove all the way around. Okay, so now all I have to do is remove the drawbar. And so I have the drawbar removed, and I just need to get the damper rod to slide out. And then I'm going to put the foot on, and temporarily I'm going to secure it with the large Allen bolt. And there we go, all done. So for the suspension to work correctly, the springs need to be compressed a little bit, called preload, and the compression amount is based on the bike and my weight and the way I ride. And Racetech recommended 20 millimeters of preload compression on the spring. So they provide a PVC pipe, which if I cut to the proper length, will compress the fork spring 20 millimeters. To figure out how long the PVC has to be, I take a couple of measurements. The first one is to install the cartridge emulator and the adapter ring on top of the damper rod. So I just drop those in. Then I put the fork spring in. And in the kit are two flat washers that go on either end of the PVC pipe. So I'm just going to throw those in. And then I measure the depth from the top of the washer to the top of the fork tube. And I end up with about 61 millimeters for that measurement. So I need to make a measurement on the cap bolt. So I'm going to screw it in to the top of the fork tube as far as it'll go. And then I'm going to measure the distance between the bottom of the bolt head and the top of the fork tube. And I get about 5 millimeters for that measurement. And then the other measurement I need to make is the distance between the bottom of the bolt head and the face of the threads. So we'll see what that comes out to be. And that's 23 millimeters. So I made this diagram to explain how I'm going to compute the length of the PVC spacer to give me 20 millimeters of preload. This was the fork tube measurement, and it was 61 millimeters from the top of the tube to the top of the second flat washer, and those two are sitting on the white plastic spacer on top of the fork spring. So that's a 61 millimeter distance. Then the cap bolt, when I screwed it all the way into the fork tube, the distance between the top of the fork tube and the bottom of the bolt head was 5 millimeters, and the distance from the bottom of the bolt head to the end of the bolt was 23 millimeters. So the difference between those is 18. So that's how far the cap bolt sticks down inside the fork tube. So to compute the length of the PVC pipe, I take 61, which was the depth to the top of the washer, minus 18, which is how far the cap bolt sticks down into the fork tube, which gave me 43 millimeters. And now I need to compress the spring an additional 20 millimeters. So that means the spacer should be 63 millimeters long. Now the ends of the spacer need to be square, so I'm going to use a tubing cutter to cut the PVC pipe. So I have the two spacers cut, and I used a little 400 grit wet dry on a flat plate just to clean the burrs off. And I also marked them as to their length and to what the preload is supposed to be that they generate. So if I pull these out, I'll know what it was I had in mind. Now to install them is pretty straightforward. Just drop one of the flat washers in and then put the spacer, and it's about flush with the top of the head, should say top of the fork tube, and then you just compress this down until you catch the thread, and there you go. So the Racetech cartridge emulators and fork springs and spacers are all installed in the fork tubes, so they're ready for installation in the bike.